It is not on Wall Street. It is not in the City of London. It is not in Zurich, Frankfurt, or Singapore. The most secretive financial institution on earth operates from behind walls that are 2,000 years old in a sovereign territory so small that you can walk its entire border in 40 minutes. It answers to no central bank. It files no public accounts. It pays no taxes to any government on earth. Its assets, gold, real estate, equity holdings, art, have never been independently audited in their entirety, and it has, over the course of the last century, been implicated in a money laundering network, a mysterious banker found hanging beneath a London bridge, the financing of a Polish trade union that helped bring down Soviet communism, and the transfer of Nazi gold through accounts that regulators are still, decades later, trying to trace. The institution is the Vatican Bank. Its official name is the Istituto per l'Opera di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. Its headquarters is a medieval tower inside Vatican City, staffed by fewer than 200 employees, and it manages assets that serious financial analysts estimated somewhere between $10 and $15 billion. Though because the bank publishes only partial accounts, even that figure is an informed guess rather than a verified number. Here is what makes this institution unlike any other bank in the world. It exists inside a sovereign state that is itself unlike any other state in the world. Vatican City, 110 acres in the heart of Rome, home to roughly 800 people, is simultaneously a religious headquarters, a diplomatic entity recognized by 180 nations, and a financial jurisdiction that operates under rules that no external regulator has ever had the legal authority to fully enforce. When European anti-money laundering directives apply to Italian banks, they stop at the Vatican border. When the European Central Bank sets monetary policy, the Vatican is watching from outside the room. How did this happen? How did an institution whose founder told his followers to give away their possessions and whose early adherents were persecuted for refusing to pay tribute to Rome end up controlling one of the most sophisticated and least transparent financial empires in the modern world? That is the story we are telling today. It takes us from a Roman emperor's deathbed conversion in 312 AD to a body hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in 1982, to a papal reform program that is still, right now, incomplete. It involves fascists, financiers, Freemasons, and at least one pope who died 33 days into his reign under circumstances that have never been fully explained. This is the Vatican's secret empire, and it is far larger, far older, and far more complicated than anything they taught you in school. To understand what the Vatican Bank is, you first need to understand what the Catholic Church is, not theologically, but structurally, because the Church is, among other things, one of the oldest continuously operating institutions in the world, and institutions that survive for 2 millennia do so partly by mastering the art of accumulating and protecting assets. The Roman Catholic Church has been receiving donations, bequests, land grants, and tribute payments since the reign of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire and ended the periodic state-sponsored persecutions that had defined the Church's first 3 centuries. More importantly for our purposes, Constantine also began the practice of making large imperial gifts of land and buildings to the Church, a practice that established the template for the next 17 centuries of Catholic wealth accumulation. By the medieval period, the Catholic Church owned approximately 1/3 of all the land in Western Europe. This was not corruption in the modern sense. It was the natural consequence of a system in which dying aristocrats and monarchs routinely bequeathed property to the Church in exchange for prayers, masses, and the assurance of spiritual benefit. The Church, unlike individual families, never died. It never divided its estates among children. It never lost property in dynastic conflicts the way noble families did. It simply accumulated generation after generation, century after century. The Reformation of the 16th century stripped the Church of enormous property holdings in Northern Europe, England, Germany, Scandinavia, as Protestant monarchs seized church assets and redistributed them to local aristocrats in the state. This was a catastrophic financial shock, and its psychological imprint on Catholic institutional thinking, the conviction that property is permanently at risk and must be protected by any available means, is still detectable in the Church's financial behavior today. What most people don't know is that the Vatican's modern financial architecture was not built over centuries. It was built in a single decade, in a single negotiation, with a single fascist dictator. Everything that has happened since, the offshore accounts, the money laundering scandals, the mysterious deaths, the reform programs, traces back to one document signed on February 11, 1929, in a ceremony that took 11 years to negotiate and whose consequences are still unfolding nearly a century later. That document was the Lateran Treaty. The man who signed it for the Italian state was Benito Mussolini. The man who signed it for the Holy See was Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, and the deal they made, which gave the Vatican sovereign statehood, a tax-free financial status, and a cash payment equivalent to roughly $1 billion in today's money, created the institutional and financial framework within which every subsequent Vatican financial scandal has occurred. But to understand why the Church needed that deal and why it was willing to make it with the fascist government, we need to go back further, to 1870, and to a conflict that left the papacy stateless, furious, and financially desperate in ways that would shape its institutional psychology for the next 60 years. In September 1870, Italian nationalist forces, the armies of the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, entered Rome and ended the Papal States. The Papal States had been a territorial entity in central Italy, governed directly by the Pope, that had existed in various forms since the 8th century. Their loss was not merely symbolic, it was the elimination of the Church's primary source of independent revenue, the end of its political sovereignty, and the beginning of what popes for the next 60 years would call the Roman question, the unresolved issue of the Church's territorial and financial status within the Italian state. For nearly 6 decades, popes refused to leave the Vatican. They declared themselves prisoners of the Italian state. They refused to recognize the legitimacy of the unified Italian government, and they accumulated within the walls of the Vatican complex a deep institutional resentment and a powerful determination to restore, by negotiation if not by force, the financial independence that the loss of the Papal States had taken from them. When Mussolini came to power in 1922, both he and the Vatican recognized an opportunity. Mussolini needed Catholic legitimacy for his regime. The Church needed financial security and formal sovereignty. The negotiation that followed took 11 years. The result was the document that created the modern Vatican financial empire. Let us go back to 1929, to a ceremony in the Lateran Palace in Rome, where two men who needed each other signed a deal that neither fully understood and that the world is still paying the consequences of today. The Torre di Niccolo V, the Tower of Nicholas V, stands near the northern edge of Vatican City, a squat medieval structure built in the 15th century as part of the fortifications surrounding the Apostolic Palace. It is not a building that draws tourists. There is no sign outside. The exterior looks like what it is, a very old stone tower that has been repurposed at some point for administrative functions. Inside, on the upper floors, is the headquarters of the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the IOR, the Vatican Bank. The institution formally came into existence on June 27, 1942, when Pope Pius XII issued a chirograph, a papal document in the Pope's own handwriting, the most personal and binding form of papal decree, establishing the IOR as an independent entity within the Holy See. But its origins are older, and its story begins with a much less formal arrangement that the Vatican had been running for decades before anyone gave it a name. The Church had been managing money for as long as the Church had existed. Donations from the faithful, income from properties, the proceeds of indulgences, the tributes of monarchs, all of it had flowed through a series of financial offices that had evolved over centuries from simple treasury functions into something considerably more sophisticated. By the 19th century, the Vatican's financial operations included currency exchange, asset management, and what we would today recognize as basic banking services for the Catholic institutions and individuals who used the Holy See as a financial intermediary. What made the IOR structurally different from every other bank in the world was the combination of 3 characteristics that no other institution possessed simultaneously. First, sovereign immunity. The IOR operated within Vatican City, a sovereign state recognized under international law, which meant that no external court, no external regulator, and no external law enforcement agency had jurisdiction over its operations without the Vatican's explicit consent. Second, no depositor base in the conventional sense. The IOR did not take deposits from the general public. Its account holders were Catholic institutions, dioceses, religious orders, Catholic charities, and certain categories of Vatican-connected individuals. This narrow account holder base meant that the consumer protection regulations that govern ordinary retail banks did not apply. Third, absolute confidentiality. The IOR maintained account records that it shared with no one, not the Italian government, not European financial regulators, not the American Treasury. Account holders were identified in the IOR's own records by number rather than name. You see, each of these characteristics, taken individually, would be unusual. Together, they created something that serious financial analysts describe as a black hole in the international financial system, an institution through which money could move without generating the audit trails that govern every other significant financial institution in the modern world. The IOR's governance structure reinforced this opacity. The bank was overseen by a 5-member lay commission of cardinals, senior church officials with no particular financial expertise, and a board of lay superintendents who were appointed by the Pope and answered ultimately only to him. There was no external board representation, no independent audit committee, no whistleblower protection framework. The institution was, in the most precise structural sense, accountable to one man. What did it actually do? In its legitimate operations, the IOR performed functions that any religious organization's financial office might. It transferred funds between Catholic institutions around the world, managed the financial affairs of religious orders that operated across multiple national jurisdictions, and provided a secure facility for the Vatican's own institutional assets. These are real and legitimate needs. A global religious organization with institutions in 190 countries genuinely requires a sophisticated financial intermediary to manage cross-border fund flows. The problem, which the Vatican's own internal investigations have in recent decades partially acknowledged, was that the structural characteristics that made the IOR useful for legitimate ones, an account at the IOR was, functionally, an account that could not be subpoenaed, could not be audited by any external authority, and whose holder could not be identified through any legal process available to foreign governments or law enforcement agencies. The number of account holders who understood and exploited this feature over the decades between the IOR's formal establishment in 1942 and its first serious reform attempt in 2010 is not fully known. What is known, from the series of scandals that have punctuated the institution's history, is that the account holder list included not only Catholic charities and religious orders, but also at various points Sicilian mafia figures, Italian political party treasurers, arms dealers, tax evaders from multiple countries, and at least one organization, the P2 Masonic Lodge, whose membership list, when it was finally revealed in 1981, read like a cast list for a political thriller. Here's the thing. The Vatican Bank did not become this way by accident or through some sudden corruption. It became this way because of a specific set of structural decisions made at its founding, which themselves reflected the specific historical circumstances of 1929 and the deal that created the modern Vatican state. To understand those decisions, you need to understand Mussolini. But before we get to the Lateran Treaty, there is one more structural element of the IOR that deserves attention, because it explains why the scandals that followed were so difficult to prosecute and so damaging to the Church's credibility: the relationship between the IOR and Italian law. Italy and Vatican City, despite sharing a city and being separated by a line on a sidewalk, are two different legal jurisdictions. Italian anti-money laundering laws do not apply inside Vatican City. Italian tax authorities have no jurisdiction over Vatican accounts. Italian courts cannot subpoena IOR records without Vatican cooperation, which the Vatican historically declined to provide. And the Italian government, which maintained a delicate diplomatic relationship with the Holy See, the world's largest religious organization, with enormous influence over Italian Catholic voters, was for decades deeply reluctant to push. This relationship of mutual dependency, mutual restraint, and mutual willingness to look the other way was the operating environment in which every Vatican financial scandal occurred. And it was created, deliberately and legally, by the document that Mussolini and Cardinal Gaspari signed on a February morning in 1929. Rome, February 11, 1929. The Lateran Palace, the ancient residence of the Bishop of Rome, now used for ceremonial occasions, was draped in the flags of both the Kingdom of Italy and the Holy See. Photographers had been admitted. The ceremony was brief. Cardinal Gaspari, the Vatican Secretary of State, sat across a long table from Mussolini, who had taken personal charge of the negotiations rather than delegating them to a subordinate. Both men signed. Cameras captured the moment. What they signed was 3 separate documents. The first was a political treaty that recognized Vatican City as a sovereign state under the full sovereignty of the Holy See, ending the Roman question that had poisoned church-state relations in Italy since 1870. The second was a concordat regulating the status of the Catholic Church within Italy, giving the Church significant legal privileges, including recognition of Catholic marriage law by the Italian civil courts and the maintenance of religious education in state schools. The third was a financial convention that is the document most relevant to our story. The financial convention provided the following. Italy would pay the Holy See 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in Italian state bonds as compensation for the loss of the Papal States in 1870. At 1929 exchange rates, this totaled approximately $92 million, equivalent, adjusted for inflation and economic scale, to somewhere between $1 and $1.5 billion in today's terms. The Holy See would pay no taxes on this payment, on the income it generated, or on any future income derived from its investment. Vatican City's financial operations would be exempt from Italian financial regulation. Consider what this meant in practice. The Church received, in a single transaction, a capital endowment that made it financially self-sufficient for the first time since 1870. It received that capital entirely tax-free. It received the right to invest it and generate income from it without any external oversight. And it received sovereign statehood, which meant that the financial privacy and legal immunity that came with that sovereignty would protect its investments from any future government's attempt to revisit the terms of the arrangement. The man the Vatican appointed to manage this windfall was a Sicilian financier named Bernardino Nogara. Nogara was not a churchman. He was a banker, a sophisticated, internationally connected financial professional who had worked for the Banca Commerciale Italiana and had extensive experience in European bond markets. Pope Pius XI gave him an extraordinary mandate to invest the Lateran Treaty funds in a way that would permanently secure the Vatican's financial independence, with no restrictions on investment, type, geography, or sector, and with no obligation to consult church authorities on individual decisions. Nogara's terms, as recorded in a Vatican memorandum from 1929, were explicit on one point. He would accept the role only if he was given complete autonomy. "I cannot manage money for an institution that tells me where to put it," he reportedly told Cardinal Gaspari. Gaspari agreed. It was, from the perspective of investment management, a reasonable condition. From the perspective of institutional oversight, it was the arrangement that would, decades later, produce catastrophic consequences. What Nogara did with the Lateran funds was, by the standards of 1929 investment, genuinely sophisticated. He diversified aggressively into Italian industrial equities, into foreign government bonds, into real estate in Rome and other Italian cities, and into a range of financial instruments that the Vatican's previous treasury officials had never worked with. He established holding companies in multiple jurisdictions to manage the equity portfolio, creating a structure that allowed Vatican assets to be held at arm's length from the IOR itself. By the time of Nogara's death in 1958, the Vatican's investment portfolio had grown from approximately $92 million to an estimated $500 million, and that is a conservative figure that almost certainly understates the real position. Because Nogara's jurisdictional structure made accurate external valuation essentially impossible. Here's what's interesting about Nogara's investment strategy. He had no ethical restrictions whatsoever. The Church's investment portfolio, under his management, included significant positions in Italian arms manufacturers at a time when those manufacturers were supplying the Italian military's campaigns in Ethiopia and Spain. It included investments in pharmaceutical companies, entertainment companies, and financial institutions whose activities would have been considered at minimum, theologically complex for an institution whose official position opposed usury, contraception, and various other modern commercial activities. Nogueira was indifferent to these contradictions. He had been hired to generate returns. He generated returns. The theological questions were someone else's department. The broader political context of the Lateran Treaty has been extensively debated by historians. Was the Church's accommodation with Mussolini's fascist regime a morally defensible pragmatic choice, the securing of institutional survival and financial independence in exchange for political neutrality? Or was it a fundamental betrayal of the Church's moral authority, a legitimization of a regime that would go on to pass racial laws against Italian Jews and enter a war that would kill tens of millions of people? The answer, in historical perspective, is probably both. The Vatican was genuinely pragmatic. It made similar concordats with the Weimar Republic in Germany, and more controversially, with the Nazi regime in 1933. It was also genuinely compromised. The 1933 Reichskonkordat with Hitler's government, which dissolved the Catholic Centre Party in Germany and committed the Church to political neutrality in exchange for the protection of Catholic institutional interests, is the most disputed act in 20th century Church history, criticized by contemporaries and historians alike as a moral abdication that contributed to the isolation of Catholic opposition to Nazism. But the financial legacy of the Lateran Treaty is what concerns us here. The deal gave the Vatican something more valuable than any of its specific financial provisions. It gave the institution a permanent legal framework, sovereign statehood, tax exemption, financial privacy, within which a series of increasingly problematic financial relationships could develop over the following half-century without ever being subject to effective external constraint. The first major test of that framework came not in the 1930s or the 1940s, but in the 1960s and 1970s, when the Vatican's financial operations became entangled with a network of Italian financiers, political fixers, and organized crime figures whose activities would eventually produce one of the most dramatic financial scandals in modern European history. The central figure in that scandal was not a Vatican official. He was a Milan banker named Roberto Calvi, a man whose career began in orthodox corporate finance and ended in the pre-dawn hours of June 18, 1982, beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, with his body hanging from the scaffolding and his pockets filled with bricks, and approximately $15,000 in cash. Roberto Calvi did not look like a man who moved in dangerous circles. Photographs from the 1970s show a thin, careful-looking man in conservative suits, with the expression of someone who spends a great deal of time reading documents and very little time making unnecessary conversation. He was, by all accounts, personally quiet, professionally ambitious, and possessed of an ability to navigate the labyrinthine intersections of Italian business, politics, and organized crime that was, depending on your perspective, either a remarkable talent or a catastrophic character flaw. Calvi rose through the ranks of Banco Ambrosiano, a Milan-based bank founded in 1896 with explicitly Catholic credentials, named after Saint Ambrose, the 4th century Bishop of Milan, to become its chairman in 1975. Banco Ambrosiano was not, at this point, a disreputable institution. It was a mid-sized Italian corporate bank with a solid client base and a board packed with prominent Catholic businessmen and local politicians. What transformed it into the instrument of one of the largest bank frauds in European history was its relationship with the Vatican Bank, and specifically with the Vatican Bank's director, a Sicilian archbishop named Paul Marcinkus. Archbishop Marcinkus was, in the mid-1970s, one of the most powerful and least publicly known figures in the Vatican. He had been appointed to lead the IOR in 1971 by Pope Paul VI, an appointment that surprised observers because Marcinkus was a pastoral priest and a former security official for papal trips, not a banker. But Marcinkus was trusted by Paul VI. He was physically imposing, 6 feet 3 inches broad-shouldered, known in the Vatican as the gorilla, and he had a quality that Paul VI valued. He was unafraid of difficult people and difficult decisions. Marcinkus and Calvi met through the network of Italian Catholic financial circles that connected Banco Ambrosiano to the IOR in the early 1970s. The relationship they developed was, on the surface, a commercial banking relationship. The IOR held accounts at Banco Ambrosiano, and Banco Ambrosiano occasionally participated in financial operations facilitated by the IOR's international connections. Beneath the surface, the relationship was something considerably more complex. The truth was that Calvi had, by the mid-1970s, become deeply embedded in a network of illicit financial relationships that connected him to P2, the Propaganda du Masonic Lodge, and through P2 to elements of Italian organized crime, right-wing political financing, and a web of offshore shell companies that existed primarily to move money in ways that Italian financial regulators could not easily trace. P2, whose membership was revealed in a 1981 police raid on the home of its Grand Master, Licio Gelli, was one of the most extraordinary organizations in post-war European history. Its membership list, found in a suitcase in Gelli's villa, included the names of 3 Italian prime ministers, 43 members of parliament, heads of all 3 Italian intelligence services, military commanders, senior judges, and the editors of major newspapers. It was, in effect, a shadow government embedded within the Italian state, with financial interests that connected it to the most opaque corners of Italian capitalism. Calvi was on the list. So, according to some investigators, was Marcinkus, though the Vatican has never confirmed this. What the Calvi, Marcinkus, P2 network used the Vatican Bank for was the movement of money across international borders in ways that generated no audit trail accessible to Italian authorities. The mechanism was straightforward in concept, though extraordinarily complex in execution. Banco Ambrosiano would make loans to a series of offshore shell companies registered in Panama, Luxembourg, and various Caribbean jurisdictions that existed only on paper. These companies would then use the loan funds for purposes that included political financing, organized crime payments, and the personal enrichment of the network's principals. The Vatican Bank would, in several documented transactions, provide letters of comfort, documents stating that the IOR either owned or stood behind the shell companies, that gave the transactions a veneer of institutional legitimacy. Look at the numbers because they tell the story. By 1982, Banco Ambrosiano had outstanding loans to its network of Panamanian and other offshore shell companies, totaling approximately $1.4 billion. The shell companies had no assets, no operations, and no ability to repay. The loans were, in effect, money that had been transferred out of Banco Ambrosiano and into a series of black holes, with no audit trail connecting the transferred funds to their ultimate recipients. In June 1982, Italian financial regulators finally moved against Banco Ambrosiano. The bank's boards declared it insolvent. Depositors, creditors, and correspondent banks were left with losses that eventually exceeded $1.2 billion, making it, at the time, the largest bank failure in Italian history. Calvi had been aware for months that the investigation was closing in. He had fled Italy on a false passport in early June, moving through Austria and England with his personal secretary. On the morning of June 18, 1982, his body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, a location with P2 symbolic significance, as Blackfriars translates to Fratelli Neri, Black Brothers, a term associated with Masonic ritual. His pockets contained approximately $15,000 in cash in various currencies and more than 11 pounds of bricks and stone, too heavy, investigators eventually concluded, for the death to have been self-suspension. The initial coroner's verdict of suicide was overturned in 1983. The case remains formally open. The Vatican Bank's response to the Banco Ambrosiano collapse was one of the most contested episodes in its history. Marcinkus denied that the IOR bore any legal responsibility for the loans that the shell companies, which he acknowledged the IOR was connected to, had failed to repay. The Vatican, after years of negotiation, agreed in 1984 to pay $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors as a voluntary contribution in recognition of moral involvement. It was not, the Vatican's lawyers were careful to note, an admission of legal liability. Marcinkus remained in his post as IOR director until 1989. Italian prosecutors issued arrest warrants for him in 1987 in connection with the Banco Ambrosiano affair. He was protected from arrest by a 1929 Lateran Treaty provision, granting Vatican employees immunity from Italian legal process. He retired to the United States in 1990 and died in Sun City, Arizona in 2006. no criminal charges were ever successfully prosecuted against him. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal was the moment at which the Vatican Bank's structural problems became impossible to ignore, not just for outside observers, but for serious figures within the church itself. A bank that could be used as a mechanism for moving $1.4 billion of fraudulent loans without generating a legally actionable paper trail was not merely an embarrassment. It was an institutional liability of the first order, capable of damaging the church's credibility in ways that no theological controversy could match. But the lesson was not immediately learned, because between the Banco Ambrosiano scandal and the next serious reform attempt, another 25 years would pass. And in those 25 years, the evidence suggests that the structural problems that had made the IOR so useful to Calvi's network had not been fundamentally addressed. In the spring of 2013, a report compiled for the Vatican by the consulting firm McKinsey & Company found that the Holy See's various departments, administrative offices, and affiliated entities owned approximately 5,000 properties in Italy alone, a figure that shocked even senior Vatican officials who had assumed the number was a fraction of that. The McKinsey report was commissioned as part of the early reform process initiated under Pope Francis, and it represented the first serious attempt to create a comprehensive inventory of Vatican-affiliated real estate holdings. What it found was consistent with what outside analysts had long suspected, and the Vatican had long declined to confirm. The Catholic Church's real estate portfolio was by any measure one of the largest and most geographically diverse private property holdings in the world. Let us establish some numbers, with the caveat that all figures relating to Vatican and Church property are estimates, because comprehensive, independently verified accounts do not exist. The patrimony of the Apostolic See, the real estate and financial assets directly owned by the Holy See, is estimated by financial analysts at somewhere between 1 and 2 billion euros in Italy, plus substantial holdings in other countries. The APSA, the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, the department that manages the property portfolio, is believed to hold approximately 2,700 properties in Rome alone, ranging from apartments and commercial buildings to palaces and entire city blocks. Beyond Italy, the picture becomes even more fragmented and harder to quantify. The Vatican's London real estate holdings alone were estimated in a 2019 Italian judicial investigation at approximately 1 billion euros, concentrated primarily in the exclusive neighborhoods of Chelsea and Kensington, where the Church has been acquiring property since the mid-20th century through a series of offshore investment structures. The London property story is worth examining in detail because it illustrates with unusual clarity the mechanisms through which Vatican financial operations have historically been managed and the problems those mechanisms have created. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Vatican's Secretariat of State, the department responsible for the Church's diplomatic and administrative functions, invested approximately 200 million euros in a fund managed by a London-based firm called Raffaele Mincione. The fund used the Vatican's capital, leveraged with borrowed money, to acquire real estate in London, including a significant stake in a luxury property development at 60 Sloane Avenue in Chelsea. What most people don't know is the extent to which this investment was made without the knowledge of the Vatican's own financial oversight bodies. The investment was authorized by senior officials in the Secretariat of State through a process that bypassed the normal Vatican financial review mechanisms, a pattern that, as subsequent investigations would reveal, was not unusual but standard operating procedure for a department that had historically regarded its financial operations as exempt from the broader Vatican administrative structure. The Chelsea investment performed poorly. By 2018, the Vatican had lost an estimated 140 million euros on the position, a loss that became the subject of a major Vatican criminal investigation announced in 2019, which resulted in the indictment of 10 individuals, including a cardinal, Angelo Becciu, who became the first cardinal in history to be tried by a Vatican criminal court. The trial, which began in 2021 and concluded in 2023, resulted in the conviction of Becciu and several co-defendants on charges including embezzlement and abuse of office. The London scandal was not an isolated incident. It was the most recent manifestation of a structural problem that had been visible in the Vatican's real estate management for decades, a system in which property acquisitions were made by multiple departments with overlapping mandates, inadequate oversight, and a consistent tendency to use offshore intermediaries and complex financial structures that obscured the identity of the beneficial owner. The Paris holdings follow a similar pattern. The Church has owned significant real estate in Paris since the medieval period, much of it concentrated in the areas around the great Paris churches and in the diplomatic quarter near the Rue de la Faïsserie. The management of these assets has historically been handled through a combination of French diocesan structures and direct Vatican administration, with the degree of overlap and accountability between these structures varying considerably over time. In the United States, the picture is different in legal structure, but similar in scale. American Catholic dioceses operate as independent legal entities under American law. They are not direct branches of the Vatican in a financial sense, and their assets are not consolidated with the Vatican's accounts. But the aggregate real estate holdings of the American Catholic Church, all those schools, hospitals, parishes, diocesan offices, and university campuses, represent a portfolio that tax analysts estimate at somewhere between $100 and $200 billion. It is the single largest private property holding in the United States. The Church's American real estate is effectively tax-exempt. Religious organizations are exempt from property tax under American law, which means that the Catholic Church's $100 to $200 billion American real estate portfolio generates no local property tax revenue for the cities and states in which it is located. The National Catholic Reporter estimated in 2021 that if Catholic Church properties in the United States were taxed at standard rates, the annual tax liability would exceed $1.6 billion, money that, in its absence, must be made up by other taxpayers or foregone by local governments. The gold standard for understanding the Vatican's real estate picture globally is the work done by David Yallop, Jason Berry, and the team at the Financial Times that produced a detailed investigation in 2020. The Financial Times investigation identified Vatican-connected property holdings in at least 30 countries, estimated the total global portfolio at approximately €3 billion at market value, and documented a management structure so fragmented across different Vatican departments, diocesan structures, and offshore vehicles that no single person within the Vatican itself had a comprehensive picture of what the institution owned. That last detail is not simply an administrative embarrassment. It is a description of a system in which accountability is structurally impossible, not because anyone designed it that way, but because 2,000 years of piecemeal acquisition, coupled with a consistent preference for privacy over transparency, has produced a property management architecture that no reform program has yet been able to comprehensively map, let alone rationalize. Pope Francis, who was elected in 2013 specifically as a reform pope, commissioned the McKinsey report precisely because he recognized that you cannot reform what you cannot see. The report gave him a partial inventory of what the Church owned in Italy. A comprehensive global inventory remains, as of the time of this script, incomplete. In December 2020, the Vatican's Financial Information Authority, the regulatory body established by Pope Francis to oversee the IOR's compliance with international anti-money laundering standards, published its annual report. The document confirmed that the Vatican Bank held, as of the end of 2019, gold reserves with a market value of approximately €26 million. This figure was presented in the context of the IOR's total assets of approximately €2.8 billion, 26 million euros. For an institution that popular mythology credits with storing billions of dollars in gold bullion accumulated over 2 millennia of religious history, the number seems almost disappointingly modest. Here is the problem. The €26 million figure refers exclusively to the gold held directly by the IOR, the Vatican Bank itself. It says nothing about the gold held by the APSA, the department managing the Holy See's general patrimony. It says nothing about the gold held by the Vatican's various foundations and affiliated entities. And it says nothing about the gold that forms part of the Vatican Museum's extraordinary collection of ancient coins, medieval ecclesiastical objects, and historical artifacts, assets whose cultural and historical value is incalculable, and whose gold content, if it were ever to be melted down and valued purely as a commodity, would be very large indeed. The full picture of Vatican gold is, like almost everything else in Vatican finances, a matter of informed estimation rather than documented fact. What we can say with confidence is this: the Catholic Church has been accumulating gold in various forms for approximately 17 centuries, gold coins as donations, gold liturgical objects commissioned by wealthy patrons, gold confiscated during the various conflicts and territorial expansions of the medieval papal states, gold received as tribute, as diplomatic gifts, and as the payment of obligations by secular rulers who owed the church money or political favors. What's interesting is that the most historically significant gold associated with the Vatican is not in the IOR's accounts. It is in the papal treasuries, in the Vatican museums, and in the fabric of the buildings themselves. The Vatican Apostolic Library holds thousands of illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf decoration whose aggregate weight is genuinely impossible to calculate. The sacristy of St. Peter's Basilica contains liturgical vessels, vestments with gold thread, and ceremonial objects that represent, in aggregate, centuries of accumulated donations from monarchs, aristocrats, and Catholic communities around the world. The gold that exists in these forms is not liquid. It cannot be sold without the theological and reputational consequences that would attend a pope selling the gold chalice donated by Charles V of Spain, or the gold tiara presented to Pius IX by Napoleon III. It is, in the economic sense, permanently frozen, assets that have value on paper but cannot be converted to cash without consequences so severe that the conversion would never be authorized. The liquid gold reserves, gold bullion held in the conventional banking sense, are a different matter. The Vatican has historically maintained a portion of its reserves in physical gold, stored primarily at the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank in New York and at the Bank of England. This arrangement dates from the Nogara era of the 1930s and 1940s, when the Vatican's investment portfolio first reached a scale that required the diversification of reserve assets across multiple international custody locations. The most controversial chapter in Vatican gold history concerns the period of the Second World War and its immediate aftermath. The accusations, documented in a series of legal proceedings, journalistic investigations, and academic studies, are serious and have never been fully resolved. The core allegation is this: during the Second World War, gold looted by the Croatian Ustaša regime from the Jewish, Serbian, and other minority populations it systematically murdered found its way, through the Vatican's financial channels, to Switzerland and Argentina, helping to fund the post-war escape of Ustaša war criminals and other Nazi-affiliated individuals through the rat lines that the Vatican's own officials, most notably the Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović, are documented to have organized. The evidence for gold transfer is complex and contested. A 1997 U.S. government investigation, the Eisenstadt Report on Nazi Gold, found that the Vatican Bank had received gold deposits from the Croatian National Bank during the war. The amounts involved are disputed. The report's estimate of 200 million Swiss francs worth of Ustaša gold was challenged by Vatican historians, who argued that the figure was a misreading of the documentation and that the actual amounts were far smaller. What is not seriously contested is that elements of the Vatican's administrative structure, primarily the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, which operated as a refugee relief organization in the post-war years, did provide documentation, transit visas, and logistical assistance to individuals who used those services to escape prosecution for war crimes. The extent to which senior Vatican officials knew the identity and background of those they were assisting remains a matter of historical debate that the Vatican's partial opening of its wartime archives in 2020 has advanced but not fully resolved. Pope Francis's decision to open the wartime archives of Pope Pius XII, which had been closed to scholars since Pius XII's death in 1958, was one of the most significant historical acts of his papacy. The materials released have provided scholars with new evidence on the wartime Vatican's knowledge of the Holocaust, on its contacts with both Allied and Axis governments, and on the gold and refugee question. The picture that has emerged is, as historians generally anticipated, more complex than either the hagiographic defense of Pius XII or the harshest prosecutorial accounts had suggested. What the archives have not provided, and what no Vatican document release has yet provided, is a comprehensive accounting of the gold that moved through Vatican financial channels during and after the war. The question of how much, from where, and to whom remains open. It may remain open permanently because the documentation that would resolve it either does not exist in recoverable form or has not yet been released. What we can say is that the gold question, both the wartime chapter and the broader question of the Vatican's gold reserves, is, Like the real estate question, a story about an institution that has historically treated financial transparency as a threat to institutional survival rather than an ethical obligation. The consequences of that institutional posture have been, across multiple decades and multiple scandals, consistently severe. In October 2010, Italian financial police seized 23 million euros from a Vatican Bank account held at Credito Artigiano, a Rome-based retail bank. The seizure was ordered by Italian magistrates investigating the IOR for suspected violations of Italian anti-money laundering regulations. Specifically, the IOR's alleged failure to provide the identification information required by Italian law for 2 large transfers totaling the seized amount. The Vatican's initial response was defiant. The Holy See's statement argued that the IOR was exempt from Italian anti-money laundering regulations by virtue of its status as a sovereign entity, and that the seizure was therefore illegal. Italian magistrates disagreed. The case wound through the Italian courts for 3 years before the seized funds were eventually returned, under circumstances that reflected the practical difficulties of prosecuting a sovereign entity rather than a clean legal victory for either side. The 2010 seizure was not the beginning of the money laundering story. It was the moment at which it became impossible to manage quietly. Because by 2010, the IOR had been under sustained pressure from European financial regulators and international bodies for years, and the pattern of transactions that had attracted their attention was both well documented and deeply troubling. The Financial Action Task Force, the international body established by the G7 in 1989 to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, had by 2010 placed the Vatican on its list of jurisdictions requiring heightened monitoring. The European Union's anti-money laundering framework, which governed the correspondent banking relationships that allowed the IOR to conduct dollar clearing transactions through US banks, was being applied with increasing strictness to Vatican-connected transactions. And Moneyval, the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering monitoring body, had begun a formal evaluation of the Vatican's financial regulation framework in 2011. The Moneyval evaluation, published in 2012, is one of the most comprehensive external assessments of Vatican financial governance ever conducted. Its findings were, in the language of technical compliance assessments, damning. The report found that the Vatican's anti-money laundering framework was deficient in multiple fundamental areas. Customer due diligence procedures were inadequate, suspicious transaction reporting mechanisms did not meet international standards, and the oversight bodies responsible for monitoring the IOR lacked both the independence and the technical capacity to effectively supervise its operations. Behind the technical compliance language, what the Moneyval report was describing was a banking institution that had operated for 70 years, without the basic controls that every other regulated financial institution in the developed world was required to maintain. Account holders were not required to demonstrate the source of their funds. Transactions were not scrutinized for the pattern irregularities that trigger suspicious activity reports at commercial banks. The beneficial owners of corporate accounts were not required to be disclosed, and the supervision of all of these processes was conducted by a body, the Cardinal's Commission, that nominally oversaw the IOR, that had neither the independence nor the expertise to do the job. The practical consequences of these deficiencies had been visible for years. In 2009, the Italian newspaper La Repubblica published a detailed investigation documenting a series of IOR-connected transactions involving accounts held by Italian organized crime figures. The investigation identified accounts held at the IOR in the names of shell companies that were, according to Italian anti-mafia investigators, connected to the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and to the Camorra criminal network based in Naples. The mechanism was straightforward. An Italian criminal figure would establish an account at the IOR, using either a directly registered account or an account held by a nominally legitimate Italian Catholic institution that the criminal controlled, and use that account to receive the proceeds of criminal activity. Because the IOR was not subject to Italian financial surveillance, and because its account records were not accessible to Italian law enforcement without Vatican cooperation, the criminal activity connected to those accounts generated no financial intelligence that could be used in prosecution. Here's the thing. The Vatican's official position, maintained throughout the 2000s and into the early years of Pope Francis's pontificate, was that it was aware of these problems and was working to address them. A series of internal reviews and organizational adjustments were announced, implemented, and found to be insufficient when evaluated by external bodies. The pattern, announcement of reform, implementation of partial measures, external assessment finding the measures inadequate, repeated itself with a consistency that led some analysts to conclude that the Vatican's reform commitment was, at least in some senior quarters, more about managing external pressure than about fundamental institutional change. The pressure from correspondent banks was, ultimately, more effective than the pressure from regulators. In 2012, JP Morgan Chase closed the IOR's euro clearing account at the bank's Milan branch, the account through which the Vatican processed a large proportion of its international financial transactions, citing the IOR's failure to provide adequate anti-money laundering documentation. Deutsche Bank followed, closing the IOR's account that processed credit card payments for purchases at Vatican museum shops and the Vatican post office. The loss of correspondent banking relationships was, in practical terms, far more disruptive to the Vatican's daily financial operations than any regulatory penalty could have been. The JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank closures happened under Pope Benedict XVI, who had announced his own reform agenda for the IOR, but whose ability to implement it was constrained by the conservative curial factions that regarded financial transparency as a threat to institutional autonomy. Benedict's resignation in February 2013, the first papal resignation in 6 centuries, was in the accounts of several Vatican insiders, at least partly motivated by his recognition that he lacked the political capacity to implement the institutional reforms that the IOR's crisis demanded. What came next? The election of Pope Francis in March 2013 and his systematic approach to Vatican financial reform is the subject of our next chapter. But before we get there, it is worth pausing on one specific transaction that illustrates more clearly than almost any other single incident the degree to which the IOR's structural problems were not merely organizational, but ethical. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, accounts connected to the IOR were used to transfer funds to accounts in the United States, connected to individuals who were subsequently identified as financing networks associated with organizations that committed acts of political violence. The details of these transactions are documented in a series of U.S. Treasury Department reports and were the subject of congressional testimony in 2002. The Vatican, when presented with these findings by American authorities, cooperated partially in the subsequent investigation, but the structural opacity of the IOR's account management system meant that the full picture of the transactions involved was never established to the satisfaction of investigators. The story of the Vatican Bank and money laundering is not ultimately a story of deliberate institutional criminality, at least not primarily. It is the story of an institution that created, through a series of historically contingent decisions beginning in 1929, a set of structural characteristics that made it extraordinarily useful to people with money they needed to make invisible, and then spent decades managing the consequences of that usefulness, rather than eliminating the characteristics that produced it. Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis on March 13, 2013, elected on the 5th ballot of a conclave that had been assembled in an atmosphere of institutional crisis. The Vatilac scandal, in which the Pope's own butler had leaked confidential documents to an Italian journalist, exposing the internal dysfunction and financial opacity of the Vatican's administrative structure, had run through the previous year. The IOR's correspondent banking problems were front-page news. The McKinsey report on Vatican property management had not yet been commissioned, but the senior cardinals who elected Francis knew enough about what it would find to understand that the institutional finances were in serious disarray. Francis was elected in part as a reformer. His background, a Jesuit from Buenos Aires, known for personal austerity, institutional directness, and a pastoral theology focused on the poor, was read by the conclave as a signal of the direction the Church needed to go. The question was whether that signal would translate into concrete institutional change, or whether it would dissipate in the face of the curial resistance that had frustrated reform-minded popes before him. The early evidence was, by Vatican standards, rapid. Within weeks of his election, Francis established a commission of 8 cardinals, the G8 as it was known, to advise him on institutional reform. He commissioned external reviews of Vatican financial management. He moved to replace the leadership of the IOR, bringing in Ernst von Freiberg, a German Catholic businessman with private equity experience, as the bank's lay president, and he signaled, in a series of public statements and private meetings, that he regarded financial transparency not as an optional institutional virtue, but as a moral requirement for an institution that claimed to speak about poverty and justice. The IOR reform program that followed was, in its early phases, the most substantive restructuring of the Vatican Bank since its formal establishment in 1942. Account holders were subjected to review for the first time, a process that eventually resulted in the closure of thousands of accounts that did not meet the criteria for IOR eligibility. Customers who could not demonstrate legitimate connection to the church or to the diplomatic community were removed. The number of active accounts fell from approximately 33,000 at the peak to fewer than 15,000 by 2015. The account closure program generated significant resistance. Religious orders that had used IOR accounts for decades found their accounts subject to review processes they had not previously experienced. Diplomatic missions whose personnel had used the IOR as a personal banking facility, one of the IOR's long-standing but technically unauthorized services, found their accounts closed. And a number of Italian Catholic institutions whose accounts had histories that did not bear close examination found themselves in difficult conversations with IOR compliance staff. The anti-money laundering framework was substantially upgraded. The IOR established a formal compliance function staffed by professionals with commercial banking backgrounds. Suspicious transaction reporting was implemented in line with international standards. Customer due diligence procedures were overhauled to require documentation of beneficial ownership that the IOR had previously never collected. And a new Vatican Financial Intelligence Unit, the Financial Information Authority, or AIF, was established as the external supervisory body for the IOR's compliance framework. In 2014, Moneyvale conducted a follow-up assessment of the Vatican's progress. The report, while noting that significant work remained to be done, acknowledged substantial improvements in the IOR's compliance framework and removed the Vatican from its heightened monitoring list. In 2015, JP Morgan Chase and other correspondent banks restored the IOR's banking relationships, having received sufficient compliance documentation to satisfy their own due diligence requirements. But here's the thing about reform in a 2,000-year-old institution. It rarely runs in a straight line. The Chelsea property scandal that emerged in 2019, in which the Secretariat of State's unauthorized investment of €200 million in a London real estate fund was exposed, demonstrated that the reform of the IOR, while real, had not extended uniformly across the Vatican's entire financial apparatus. The Secretariat of State had operated, effectively, as a parallel financial system that the IOR reform had not touched. The Becciu trial that followed, the first criminal prosecution of a cardinal in Vatican history, was, in one reading, evidence that the reform process was working. Misconduct that had previously gone unpunished was now being prosecuted. In another reading, it was evidence that the reform process had been captured by internal Vatican power politics, with Becciu's prosecution reflecting factional conflicts as much as institutional anti-corruption commitment. The historical truth is probably some of both. The question of whether the Vatican Bank should continue to exist in its current form is one that reform-minded figures within the Church have raised with increasing directness. A 2013 recommendation from an external advisory committee suggested that the IOR could be wound down and replaced with a simpler Vatican treasury function, with the Church's banking needs met through regulated commercial banks. Francis declined to implement this recommendation, choosing instead to reform the IOR rather than eliminate it. His reasoning, that a reformed IOR serving its legitimate function was preferable to the Church being entirely dependent on external commercial banking relationships, is defensible. But it preserved the institution whose structural characteristics had generated the scandals in the first place. What is genuinely new and genuinely significant in the Francis reform era is the shift in institutional posture. For the first time in its history, the Vatican has moved toward acknowledging in official documents and public statements that its financial practices have fallen short of ethical standards that the Church itself proclaims. The annual reports now published by the IOR and the AIF represent a level of financial disclosure that would have been unimaginable under John Paul II or Benedict XVI. The external auditing processes that now govern the IOR's accounts are real, if imperfect. The distance between where the Vatican was in 2010, correspondent banking relationships being severed, Moneyval reports condemning its compliance framework, criminal investigations proceeding in Italian courts without Vatican cooperation, and where it was in 2020 is real and should be acknowledged. The reform is genuine. It is also, by any external measure, incomplete. The Vatican's annual financial reports, which have been published since 2013, show an institution that is, by the numbers, smaller than its reputation suggests and larger than its institutional role requires. The IOR's total assets at the end of 2022 were approximately 2.4 billion euros. Its annual net profit, the revenue from investment management and banking services minus operating costs, was approximately 29 million euros. For comparison, Goldman Sachs reported annual profits of approximately $11 billion in the same year. By the standards of the commercial banking sector, the Vatican Bank is a modest institution, a medium-sized private bank whose asset base and income are dwarfed by the thousands of commercial banks that operate in European markets. Its significance is not financial scale. It is structural uniqueness, the combination of sovereign immunity, historical opacity, and institutional longevity that makes it unlike any other financial entity in the world. The future of the Vatican's financial empire faces pressures from several directions simultaneously. The first and most immediate is the continuing evolution of international financial regulation. The global anti-money laundering framework has tightened substantially since 2010, and the correspondent banking relationships that the IOR depends on for international transactions require ongoing compliance work that the institution was simply not designed to provide. Every year, the compliance burden increases. Every year, the cost and organizational effort required to maintain those banking relationships grows. The second pressure is demographic. The Catholic Church's global membership is shifting rapidly from the developed world, Europe and North America, where the wealthy dioceses and foundations that have historically been the Church's primary financial base are concentrated, to the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, where Catholic communities are growing rapidly, but where the economic capacity to fund the institutional church is limited. The Church of 2050 will be demographically larger than the Church of 2023. It will also, in all likelihood, be financially smaller in real terms. The third pressure is the sexual abuse crisis, not a financial story in its origins, but one with profound financial consequences. The settlements paid by American Catholic dioceses to survivors of clerical sexual abuse have, since the early 2000s, totaled more than $4 billion. Several American dioceses have filed for bankruptcy under the weight of abuse liability. The reputational damage to the Church and the resulting decline in donations, bequests, and institutional support in the countries most affected has been substantial and ongoing. What does the Vatican's financial future look like given these pressures? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the Vatican's own internal projections, if they exist in comprehensive form, are not public. What outside analysts can observe is a pattern of institutional behavior that suggests the Church is managing a gradual financial contraction while maintaining the structural characteristics, the sovereign immunity, the opacity preference, the resistance to full external oversight that have historically been its most valuable financial assets. The real estate portfolio will almost certainly shrink. Pope Francis has explicitly committed to reducing the Church's property holdings in favor of financial instruments that are easier to manage and more transparent to oversight. The 5,000 Italian properties identified in the McKinsey report include a very large number of underperforming assets, apartments rented at below market rates to political allies and church-connected individuals, commercial buildings in secondary locations that generate minimal income, vacant properties with significant maintenance costs. Rationalizing this portfolio is an obvious priority. It is also an enormous political and administrative undertaking that will take decades to complete. The IOR's future is the most actively debated question in Vatican financial circles. The arguments for maintaining it as a specialized bank for Catholic institutions are real. A global church with institutions in 190 countries does need a sophisticated financial intermediary. The arguments for winding it down and replacing it with a simpler treasury function are equally real. The compliance costs of maintaining a regulated banking institution are rising. the reputational risks of another scandal are severe. And the legitimate banking needs of the Catholic Church can, in theory, be met by properly structured relationships with commercial banks. Pope Francis, who will be 87 years old at the time of this script's production, has not resolved this question. His successor, whoever that proves to be, will inherit both the reformed institution that Francis has partially built and the unreformed characteristics that the reform process has not yet reached. The outcome will depend heavily on the direction of that successor's own institutional priorities. Here is the question that the Vatican's financial story ultimately poses. Can an institution that has been shaped by 2,000 years of accumulation, a century of structured opacity, and a series of financial scandals whose consequences are still being adjudicated, genuinely transform itself into a model of financial transparency and ethical management, while remaining what it is, while maintaining the sovereign immunity that its financial independence depends on, while managing the tension between institutional self-preservation and the moral demands of a theology that began by telling its followers to give everything away? The answer matters beyond the Vatican itself, because the Vatican's financial story is, in miniature, a story about every institution that has ever tried to balance power and principle, that has ever discovered that the mechanisms you use to protect your mission can, over time, become the greatest threat to it. The Swiss bank accounts, the offshore shells, the letters of comfort that authorized $1.4 billion in fraudulent loans. None of these were the mission. All of them were, in the minds of the people who used them, means of protecting the mission. The distance between protecting the institution and corrupting it is, in the Vatican's case as in every other, much smaller than the institution itself has ever been comfortable acknowledging. So we have seen how a 110-acre sovereign state in the heart of Rome built a financial empire that stretches across 6 continents, from gold held in the Federal Reserve vaults in New York to luxury apartments in Chelsea, from offshore holding companies in Panama to an ancient stone tower whose account records were, for 70 years, accessible to no external authority on earth. Today, the Vatican Bank publishes annual reports, employs compliance professionals, and maintains correspondent banking relationships with institutions that require ongoing due diligence documentation. The AIF monitors suspicious transactions. The account holder list has been reduced from 33,000 to fewer than 15,000. A cardinal has been criminally convicted. A reform process, genuine if incomplete, is underway. The modern relevance of this story is not difficult to find. In an era in which the regulation of offshore financial centers, the beneficial ownership of shell companies, and the tax treatment of religious organizations are all live policy debates in multiple countries, the Vatican's history offers the most extreme case study available of what happens when a financial institution operates without effective external oversight for an extended period. The answer, money laundering, fraud, political corruption, and a series of mysterious deaths whose full explanations remain disputed, is not reassuring. The balanced assessment that the Vatican's financial story demands is genuinely difficult to render because the institution involved is not merely a bank. It is the administrative center of a religious organization that genuinely feeds the hungry, educates the poor, cares for the sick, and provides meaning to the lives of approximately 1.3 billion people. The Catholic Church's network of hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations represents the largest private social welfare system in human history. Measuring that contribution against the financial scandals is not a calculation that produces a clean answer. The real lesson here is not that the Vatican is uniquely corrupt. It is that institutional opacity, the systematic absence of external accountability, predictably produces outcomes that deviate from institutional values, regardless of how genuine those values are. The Church's financial scandals were not caused by an absence of good Catholics. They were caused by the absence of the structural constraints that turn good intentions into accountable behavior. Transparency is not a threat to mission. It is, in the long run, the only reliable protection for it. Whether we like it or not, the Catholic Church's financial practices will continue to shape the lives of 1.3 billion people and the policy debates of dozens of governments for the foreseeable future. The reform process, initiated under Francis, is real but fragile. Fragile because it depends on individual papal will rather than structural institutional change, and because the next pope may have different priorities. The architecture of sovereign immunity, financial privacy, and curial resistance to external oversight that was built in 1929 and reinforced over 9 subsequent decades is not dismantled by a series of annual reports and a compliance function. So the question remains, does an institution that claims to speak for an ethical vision of human society have an obligation to embody that vision in its financial practices? And if the answer is yes, which seems difficult to contest, then what does it mean that the most powerful religious institution on earth is still, in 2024, conducting financial operations behind walls that the rest of the world cannot see through? The tower at the north end of Vatican City is still there. The medieval stone is unchanged. Inside, on the upper floors, the accounts are still being managed, more carefully than before, more transparently than before, but still in a room that no external auditor has ever had the unrestricted right to enter. 2,000 years of accumulated history is a very long time. The question is whether the institution that carries that history is finally prepared to pay the price of the transparency that its own stated values have always demanded. If you made it this far, through the Lateran Treaty, Blackfriars Bridge, the Chelsea Apartments, and the medieval tower that houses one of the world's most unusual banks, leave a comment with the word Torre. That is our signal that you stayed for the full story. If this kind of investigative financial history is what brings you to Economist, the stories behind the institutions that shape the world, told with the depth and the documentation that the subject deserves, then subscribe. We publish this level of research consistently, and the archive covers everything from the founding of the Federal Reserve to the collapse of Enron. The natural next video from here is our documentary on the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, established in 1930 in Basel, Switzerland, which has operated for 90 years with a level of secrecy that makes even the Vatican Bank look transparent. It is the institution that coordinates global monetary policy behind closed doors, that maintained its operations through the Second World War with both Allied and Axis members on its board, and whose full membership and voting arrangements are still not publicly disclosed. It is, in several respects, the most powerful financial institution most people have never heard of. That video is linked on screen now. We will see you there.